Hi, I'm Ruth Goodman, and today we'll be talking about health in Victorian Britain. We'll be talking about the move towards clean water supplies, improved waste disposal, antiseptics in hospitals and in the home. We'll then learn about the slow adoption of germ theory and how it improved life expectancy. Now, the first thing to think about and to remember is that cleanliness had always been important to British people, and indeed to people in other parts of the world too. But people didn't really know quite how cleanliness benefited their health. They thought that by being clean, they were preventing bad odours which carried disease from penetrating into their bodies. People were very worried about the smell coming from dung heaps, from marshes, from industry. Anything that smelt bad, they believed, carried disease. Now, that in some ways is not so very far away from what we think now. And obviously, with those thoughts in mind, people before Victoria's era were naturally keen on cleanliness. Cleanliness in the home, cleanliness in food preparation, cleanliness in the world around them. But they didn't really understand the absolute mechanisms that went from filth to sickness. And that is something that develops in the Victorian era. So when you imagine the world before Victorian health changes came into place, you must imagine a world in which people are trying to be clean, but not necessarily always getting it quite right. No, people did not all stink to high heaven and live in permanent filth. They tried to be clean. But their ideas of cleanliness were often more to do with how white and clean your underwear was, rather than, for example, how you dispose of your human waste. So if you visited somewhere where people had plenty of resources, say some middle-class home, you would find it spick and span. You would find it sweet smelling. You would find everybody neatly turned out, the laundry done, all the human waste got rid of as quickly as possible, the paths outside swept. Everything would seem very pleasant. But in areas where people had less resources, it was very much harder to maintain a state of cleanliness. And there, of course, dirt collects. And of course, people are people. I mean, I'm sure in your modern life, you know people who are super clean and people who are really not. And the two can live side by side, can't they? And so it was in the past that we have a variety of experiences, from those that would pass for modern hygiene to those that were filthy, desperate, disgusting. Often it's the desperate that makes the difference. People who have no resources, no time, no energy, no tools, nothing which would enable them to be clean. After all, you can't have clean laundry if you haven't got any laundry facilities, can you? And if we look at the wider world, people's understanding of pollution and managing it was also very different. And that could cause huge problems, particularly where you were talking about water supplies. Now, the thing that really makes a difference in the Victorian period is the acceptance of germ theory. Now, this is an idea that had been trickling about for a little while, and people hadn't really been taking it seriously. Particularly important, for example, were the observations that happened in a maternity hospital on the continent, where it was noticed that the doctors who went straight from doing autopsies to delivering babies had a terrible death rate amongst their patients. The women got septicemia, they died. Whereas women who were delivered by midwives, who had nothing to do with the other forms of sickness, well, their patients tended to survive far more often. And these observations began to build up and to make people ask different questions about the nature of disease. But it was very controversial. The new idea that there might be living organisms that were indeed making the disease, causing it, carrying it, that it was the result of an invasion by a foreign living thing. Well, it was a very radical idea, and of course it threatened the entire medical establishment. I mean, they already had jobs and a training scheme and a whole professional structure, and here was this brand new idea which challenged everything they'd been taught. They were extremely reluctant to accept the idea or to change anything in face of this new information. What we see in the Victorian period is a long, slow fight to get this new idea widely accepted. You may have heard Florence Nightingale being held up as a model of hygiene. People tell stories about how she completely changed that hospital out in the Crimea, that it was her influence on cleanliness that made the difference. But Florence Nightingale herself did not believe in germ theory. She still thought it was about air pollution. If you read her most famous book, you will see that it is entirely based on the idea that, the old idea, that disease was in the air in bad smells. All her hygiene methods are things like opening the windows, getting fresh air in, taking smelly things away from patients. There's nothing in there about germ theory, about the idea of bacteria or indeed viruses. That might come as a bit of a surprise to many people. So, as things begin to move forward, as the idea begins to spread, we see this resistance, we see pockets of move forward and pockets of resistance going on at the same time. And there are several really important moments. Perhaps the most important moment for the health of ordinary people is John Snow and his water pump in London. Now, he was a very open-minded medical man, and he could see that there must be something in this new germ theory. And when he noticed a real cluster of cholera going on, he had a novel idea about how to investigate. He started plotting it on a map. Everybody who'd got the cholera, where were they? And when he started looking at the map, he could see that it was one small area, but not everybody. There was a pattern within a pattern, that there was a concentration in one area, but some people were getting the cholera, and right in the midst of it, some people weren't. So he started asking questions. He basically went out with a survey and said, well, what are your habits? What are you doing? And this is how he discovered that there was a correlation, a very close correlation, between people who worked in the local brewery and people who didn't. And the people who worked in the brewery were healthy. They got free beer. The people who didn't work in the brewery, who were using the local well for their drinking water, they were the ones getting sick. And this piece of information was key. It was just so provable. He literally took the handle off the pump so that nobody could use it, and the cholera outbreak stopped. This was information that everybody could understand, that it was easy to persuade other people, look, here is the proof. This is simple cause and effect. This must be true. It is little tiny creatures transmitting disease, and they are being carried in the water supply. It concentrated minds. It convinced. Suddenly, it was like a tidal wave. All these thoughts and ideas about germs had been building and had been poo-pooed and pushed aside, but the body of knowledge suddenly reached a point in which you couldn't deny it any longer. It was a tipping point. And from then on, the health within Victorian Britain begins to improve dramatically as more and more people start to understand how to combat disease. And they begin by changing the water supply and by changing the way we get rid of dead bodies and human waste. And in cleaning those things up, we see a major change in people's life expectancy. At the beginning of Victoria's reign, the average life expectancy was hovering at about 37, 38-ish. by the end of Victoria's reign, once we get clean water and decent waste disposal, we're looking at 48. Now, I know that by modern standards, even 48 sounds quite young, but it's a big difference. 10 years. And more than that, a blueprint on how to carry on improving that number. So if you were to look around a Victorian pharmacy, the things that you should really be looking out for, the things that made the difference, that improved people's health, well, it's not so much all the little bottles of strange, weird and wonderfuls, or the poisons and so forth here. It is, in fact, carbolic soap and antiseptics. These are the things that allowed people to take charge, to take control of their health within their own homes, upon their own bodies, to help deal with the problems. Big government, big organisations were required to deal with things like water supply, but the day-to-day stuff you could do at home yourself. It was a new power to the people. Next time, we'll be looking at how work changed for most of the population in Victorian Britain, with shift working made possible by gaslight, a new adherence to fixed hours of work, and a fierce concentration upon a smaller number of tasks whilst at work.